Listen, thanks very much, Jennifer, and thank you very much for the invitation just to speak this morning. Also, I'd say to begin to thank all the organisations, agencies and people active in the Clondalkin community who we worked with over a period of time to pull this plan together. And I have to say I was privileged to be able to work with such a fine set of people and a dedicated set of people. It's obvious enough, I think, from the title of the conference and from the explanation and rationale behind this plan that this is about change, that this strategy is about change. And change is never easy, but I think that it became easier because the plan itself was the result of work with a series of planning meetings involving residents in Clondalkin who are working to address the causes and consequences of drug and alcohol abuse together with people who are delivering mainstream services. That's who we worked with to put this plan together. But most importantly, and I think a very, very important starting point, and Sandra has already alluded to this, was the research that was done in Clondalkin that actually was very, very explicit in terms of naming what the issues are here, what the challenges are. And I think it was very refreshing to see such a piece of research that said, let's name it, let's say what's actually happening here. And really the two things that the research said was that there was a centralised top-down service delivery model in operation, and that actually negates the real potential for communities to have a meaningful say in what's happening. So that was actually been said, that this was happening. And that both, and Sandra has said this, that both the causes and the consequences of drug and alcohol abuse are integral parts of a community that is facing increasing disadvantage, poverty, deprivation, and that strategies which actually isolate drug and alcohol abuse and deal with these in isolation actually become part of the problem rather than part of the solution, that if these are not seen in an integrated and integral way. So that research probably left people in Clondalkin with a lot of very stark choices. In other words, how do we handle this? Do we do more of the same? Do we look at, or do we look at trying to look at a way, a structure, a model, a pathway, or some kind of strategy that might lead us to change? And this is where we actually use the theory of change, providing a framework for people to ensure that the plan wouldn't actually be about doing more of the same and hoping for the best, but that it would work out, what does reclaiming community development actually look like? What does that actually mean? Because there is something about reclaiming community development or rebuilding community development or rebuilding the strength of the community, but there was a much bigger challenge out there, and that was actually about rebuilding a community that had been actually torn apart, devastated. And that actually wasn't maybe about building community development, it was about maybe regenerating a whole community. And I think it's very, very important to remember that for a community like Clondalkin, we're starting from a position of very proud history in community development and activism over a long period of years, but person after person, organisation after organisation, acknowledging the fact that this had gone in the sense of it having any say in what was happening, that it had lost any power that it had. So this is what the challenge was in terms of community development. The goal, as you can see, and I'm not going to, because people have a copy of the plan, and I'm not going to go through an awful lot of this, but the main goal was about re-establishing and strengthening the role of community to tackle the causes and consequences of drug and alcohol misuse, not because community organisations wanted to be at the centre or want to be driving something, but of an absolute and total conviction that that is the most effective way to actually address issues. And if a holistic approach is needed, if there is an approach needed that doesn't just look at very narrow service delivery in terms of only a medical service delivery model in a lot of cases, and that if that is able to actually encompass a wider social analysis of what's happening in the community, for that to happen, the community has to be involved. The community has to be centre of that. And therefore then to support a holistic approach to dealing with both causes and consequence. Now, in terms of what's in the plan and how it's put together, like dealing with the effects and tackling the causes, in many ways, what has come out of this strategy mirrors what the intention and aspiration is in the national drug strategy, and actually is very, very consistent with what's attempting to be achieved in the national strategy. But I think that the difference in what the plan for Clondalkin that has emerged is that what has been said here is that when dealing with the effects of drug and alcohol abuse and the devastating effects that that has in the community, and dealing with the causes, trying to look at why does this happen, can we prevent it from happening, that actually both of those must be seen as part of the same process, and more importantly, that both of those sets of activities need to feed into having an influence on what happens in policy and how services are delivered and how are not. Now, this was put together simply for the reason that people began with the assertion that that doesn't exist now. That doesn't. In effect, what was being seen from the research and from the planning process was that people were delivering services and doing them very, very effectively and heroically in an awful lot of instances, an awful lot more than ever what they were paid for. But actually, they were doing it in terms of a pre-defined set almost of instructions or prescriptions as to what to do. And all the knowledge, the local information, the local capacity that there is there to tackle these issues in terms of community organisation was being lost, and it certainly was being lost to any kind of informed policy response. So the policy response was very, very different, distant, self-regulatory, and communities were being asked to implement rather than to influence. So the essential difference in what is being attempted in this strategic plan is to bring both of these, tackling the effects and causes together, and actually do it in a way that has an influence, and that this is the only way that you can actually put community back at the centre. The three strategic goals, again, there just reflect these three elements in terms of looking at the effects, is to provide person-centred supports, effective service responses, but that is done in a way that actually promotes self-determination as well as meaningful progression opportunities for those who are affected by drug abuse. Secondly, that in terms of building awareness and looking at the causes of drug abuse and alcohol abuse, that to contribute to the development of a more informed, more empowered and more motivated residents to shape their own communities and to deal with these range of challenges that are contributing to drug and alcohol abuse. So about strengthening communities. And then thirdly, to bring together local knowledge and expertise to bring this to the planning and delivery of mainstream services and local development programs, which then contributes to a much more flexible, responsive, and ultimately more effective approaches. And in the end, most likely more cost-effective outcomes. So these were the three goals. There were three sets of core guiding principles that people actually committed themselves to, that is a core central part of this plan. And I think the difference, and again, I'm not going to go through these in detail because people have the document, you can read over it, I know there are questions coming back in a lot of this, but to me, the big difference and very important difference in this plan is that people defined what do you mean by this. They're very, very often phrases that are bandied about all the time when people pledge allegiance to a human rights-based approach, person-centred approach, evidence-based approach has become particularly popular in all sorts of policy documents. But actually I think the difference here is that there was the effort to spell out exactly what this meant. And again, these are spelled out inside the plan. What do you mean? What is a human rights-based approach? How does that actually implement or affect how you deliver services and how you tackle challenges? What does a personal-centred approach mean? Which was extremely important, because person-centred approach meant that there's a very clear commitment in this plan to look at being discerning, at actually being discriminating, if you like, if you put it that way, because the rationale being that a top-down service delivery model, if it's not community-driven, will always benefit the people who need services least. And only through community involvement, active community engagement, and the person-centred approach can you make sure that the people who are most distant right now from services and need them most are the people. So very often even improvements, and this has been proven in a lot of international anti-poverty studies, even very significant improvements in central service delivery mechanism can actually contribute to inequality. It can increase inequality, because the people that actually access the new improvement, the new services, are the ones that are already closest to those. The ones in those areas, and this is not just a geographical phenomenon, it was looking across Clondalkin where the most absolute acute needs were, but it was also very discerning in terms of saying there are very clear challenges for the traveller community, there are very clear challenges for people from different ethnic backgrounds that are very different, and they don't fit this one-size-fits-all, and actually will inevitably lose out unless the community development approach. So essentially, that's why the person-centred approach. The evidence-based approach, and I know that Graham Otwell is going to speak in the afternoon about evaluation, but from our point of view, if what's been attempted here is very, very ambitious. It's actually trying to regenerate something that has been taken away and lost and eroded. But if it is to succeed, absolutely the evidence is critical. Because if communities are to have a very informed and effective dialogue and negotiation process almost with statutory agencies and services, then that must be based on sound evidence. It must be based on saying, we know that this approach works. We know that there are broader impacts. There are broader benefits to be had in a community like Clondalkin if we undertake this. And it also means then that evidence is very different. It's a different set of evidence that you need to collect. It doesn't very often fit into nice little boxes that you can tick, and I know that we're all being asked to be very expert at ticking boxes in all sorts of directions for very good reasons and being accountable, but actually it's very limited in terms of being able to say, how do we really know what change? And especially when we're looking at the causes of drug and alcohol abuse, not just the effects. So evidence became very important. The programs and actions, there are three sets of, if you like, structures that are being set up in this strategy, and there's a structure being set up under each of the three that I've just mentioned. In other words, to set up a group of interests, people, stakeholders around particular issues who begin to negotiate, collaborate, all those words that we use all the time, but we don't actually usually, we just pay homage to them without actually doing it. But it means that if you set a group up around tackling the effects of drug abuse, then you're looking at different elements of that. There's an outreach element to it. There's a service delivery element to it. There are progression pathways needed if you're going to effectively deal with the effects of drug abuse. There is a need to strengthen families, and there's a need to empower drug users themselves, as the Minister had alluded to earlier in her contribution. So, whereas goal one in terms of dealing with the effects, the easy way is to look at delivering services, and that is the usual silo-based approach, but that it needs to be broader, and actually amount of interest that are brought around this issue can actually change. So as you're looking at one particular issue that emerges for drug use, which could be about around creating progression, around creating hope for people that are in a particular situation, then it's not usually the usual suspects in terms of the agencies that you might need to bring on this. It might not be the health services, it might not be the mental health services. It could well be the people who are involved in long-term adult education. It could be the schools for younger people. So there needs to be a flexibility, but most of all, there needs to be that kind of commitment for interests to congregate around each other on the basis of equality and of parity of esteem, so that the community has a real say in how do we understand this and how do we go about it, and let's make joint decisions about how we do it. And I think that's the essential difference between the strategy that people in Clondalkin have committed themselves to, rather than saying, well, as one actor, the community is willing to sit and wait to see what the next set of instructions are, because I think that's very tiring for people. I think it has worn people out over the last number of years, to be honest, and it's very, very, very demotivational. So it's beginning to set up a situation where you can create those forum for negotiation between individuals, community interests, and service providers that begin to get a handle and get a joint approach. And I suppose in many ways it's going back to what drugs task forces originally intended to do. If you read the original strategy, it's almost word for word, that kind of thing. But it has become something else and needs to go back again. So similarly, when you're looking at tackling the causes, that it's not just about facilitating networking, it is about re-establishing community strength and about building knowledge and awareness. And that when influencing, if local services and national services are to be influenced, then you must build an evidence base, you must develop guidelines and protocols. How does this new arrangement with agencies get mediated? Really by a set of protocols that are very clear to each, a set of commonly understood definitions, and that absolutely ongoing review is essential. So I suppose, in a sense, just to finish, like when we began this process, I think people were faced with a very stark choice in terms of will we keep doing the same and hope for a better outcome, or do we actually take on board what has been said in this research and attempt to come to grips with what would a new situation look like? What is in this strategy is not easy. It's not the easy way out. The easy way out would have been to do more of the same. It's a new venture, but I also agree with what the Minister said in terms of it being a very, very good example and a starting point, I think, even if it's a starting point for discussion for other drugs task forces in other communities and other areas. But it absolutely names it, and I think that I just would like to congratulate everyone that was involved in this, because it is a courageous stand to take and say, we know that this is what is going to work. And also to wish everybody all the best in actually implementing and pushing this forward in many directions. And I look forward to the rest of today's discussion. So thank you very much.